What We Cannot See Pioneers, Season 2, Episode 8. Before I read this, guys, I thought I'd just say a couple of things. Pretty much from this point onward, until maybe the last couple of episodes, I'm not really going to stream any pictures for my narration. And the reason for that is, one, it's kind of a pain in the ass to keep posting them. And I want to get these episodes out, hopefully by the end of the weekend, just wrap up Pioneers so that, I can focus on other things in my own life, and also Season 3 of What We Cannot See. I can clear the path and open up that, so that that's the last thing I have to do for the series, and I can finish it up. And another thing is, I don't want to give a definite image of what is coming in this episode. I want you guys to hear what I have to say in the description, in the story, and, let your imaginations run. You guys come up with your own images in your head of what is about to happen. So that's going to be the case for the next couple of episodes. Now, to some of the stranger parts of Pioneers. Sudden fear began settling about the entire army, as many soldiers and participants of it pointed back to the giant door they passed through. It had been shut tight. If a few Bionicles managed to push against it, they might be able to open it again. But the shut door symbolized to many that this dark shadowy chamber some believed to be a garage, this was the point of no return. With the omnipresent odor, stronger than ever in this garage, and the darkness of the entire place enshrouding the army, it was believed that the Byasein made its nest somewhere in this garage. Minifig soldiers checked their rifles. Bionicle warriors found objects to sharpen their swords upon. Even Prime Minister Stanley Gugino removed a small pistol from a holster on his belt and loaded it, fearing he too might have to fight the Byasein. But more so than the Byasein, everyone in the army was wanting to find this strange minifig who had led them here, the one claiming to have written the book Observations of a Strange World. The army stood still, looking all around for any sign of this minifig. He was nowhere to be found. Gugino looked out into the shadows of the chamber. He could make out large structures across the dark landscape. As his eyes further adjusted to the darkness, the objects looked like cardboard boxes, giant cardboard boxes that hid what might be behind them. As he looked into the shadows, an immensely faint but very distinct sound registered in his ears. "Everyone!" Gugino yelled. "Be silent! Listen." The entire army obeyed, and everything was shut down, even the large vehicles whose running motors might hide the quiet noise. The faintness of this noise signified that its source was far away from the army, but within this chamber indeed. The sound of 1,000 little things tinking against each other. The sound presented two things. The first was that this garage was massive, and they were only in one very small region of the garage. Certainly, they could go much, much deeper into it. The second was still to be confirmed, but the sounds, along with the strange smell, suggested even further that the Byasein was here, in this chamber. The entire army was suddenly ambushed by great light all about them. Blasting rays of yellowish light of an almost gooey essence sprayed across not only the entire army, but the entire chamber, illuminating everything around the group. The soldiers flinched, but when their eyes adjusted, they immediately looked up. The immense light was coming from titanic light bulbs, hanging from the faraway ceiling of this garage chamber, only reinforcing the fact that this place was a real house. How could it not be, if the lights were actually functioning? "Light," Icarax said in a whisper. On their carrier trucks, the minifig leaders, General George, Colonel Carlos, Captain Mike, Brian, and Clark, along with the Prime Minister, all looked at each other in shock. "What turned those lights on?" General George asked some of his fellows. Mike looked around the chamber. If the lights were turned on, there had to be a switch somewhere. A giant switch on one of the walls. He turned around to look behind the army, focusing on the door they had passed through. He looked at the walls next to the threshold. looking up for any sign of a kind of light switch. "Look!" Mike shouted, pointing behind the army high on one of the walls. Heads throughout the group turned and looked back at the wall behind them. High up from where they stood was a light switch indeed, switched to the on position on the wall. "What switched that on?" General George asked, seeing that there was nothing nearby that could have flicked that switch. The sounds that Gyutonoa had pointed out were still present, as was the smell, but the light from the ceiling light bulbs revealed the path that lay ahead of the army in the distance. Gyutonoa looked, confirmed his thoughts that the structures around them were cardboard boxes. Near the boxes were makeshift shells of a massive size, all things that owners of this house might have once used. And all of these things were concealing what was behind them. "Look!" a soldier shouted in the army, and there was terror in his voice. The soldier raised an arm in the direction of the path down which Gyutonoa was looking. On the ground of that path was a minifig corpse, lying limp and positively dead on the floor. But even from their distance, the army knew that this body was the body of the minifig they had encountered earlier, the one who supposedly wrote observations of a strange world. The minifig was dead, and the army knew he had always been dead, even when he appeared before them a while ago introduced himself. Even then he was dead. Embedded into the back of the minifig corpse's torso was a long metal rod. Attached to that rod was the arm of a bionicle, and attached to that other end of that arm were many pieces of minifig construction. The stream of parts formed what was identical to the tentacles controlling the monsters throughout the new land. This minifig was one of the monsters, a tool used by the Byasein. The Byasein had lured the army here by feeding the minifig corpse through the opening of the door earlier, and animating him somehow to speak to the army. No one was surprised. Suddenly the dead minifig body twitched, as did the long stream of parts he was attached to. The parts extended far behind the shelves in the distance of the garage, and very slowly the stream of parts dragged the minifig body behind the shelves as well. "The Byasein," Mike said softly. His fellow generals looked to him curiously. Mike continued, "The Byasein turned on those lights." "How?" Colonel Carlos asked. Mike shook his head. He did not know. But what else could have switched them on? "We must go down that path," Gyutonoa said. "When we see our enemy, we will face it." General George overheard Gyutonoa say this. He noticed Gyutonoa did not say, "We will defeat it." There was no telling if they would. The drivers of the vehicles, after hearing orders from their radios that the time to move deeper into the garage had come, turned their machines back on, and the low rumble of many machine engines began sounding off. Kopaka and the Black Gear Bionicles saw this, and got ready to move out too. Ikarax, Archimod, and Gavla all braced themselves as well. This army had no idea what the Byasein was. What they were about to face could be anything of any kind. It might kill them the instant it saw them, but somehow it was worth it. The Byasein had been killing thousands of minifigs and bionicles. Families and friends were horrifically butchered by this almost supernatural entity. If the last thing they could see before their deaths was the true form of their hated and elusive enemy, for many, that was enough. Minifig soldiers began looking at each other, nodding to one another, and then grasping their rifles firmly. They then formed together and moved to the front of the army. They understood their duty. As soldiers, they were to protect their leaders. These men were supremely fearful of what was to come, but they understood their roles in this campaign. After a few moments of mental preparation, they had finally come to terms with the fact that it was they who were to be at the front lines as the army moved in to confront the Byasein. "Everyone," Gyutonoa began with a loud voice, "move in!" Nothing more needed to be said. So strong was the belief that the Byasein was in this garage that everyone was beginning to deal in their own ways with the very real possibility that they might not return alive from this expedition. But it didn't matter. They must confront the Byasein. Down the path Gyutono had pointed out, lined with cardboard boxes that dwarfed everyone in the group, the New Land Army pushed forward. Gyutono on his own carrier truck focused hard on trying to track the strange tinking noise. It was comparable to 1,000 wind chimes clinking together simultaneously. It was getting slightly louder as the army moved further inward. Gyutono looked down the path they were following. Had the Byasein itself moved these giant boxes to lure them down this path? The army was preparing to turn the corner into the larger part of the garage, the place where the Byasein was most likely nesting. The hearts of every being in the army began viciously pounding against their chests, and no matter how confident or courageous some of the members portrayed themselves to be, no one was without fear. Gyutono looked at the soldiers leading the army. As they rounded the corner, their faces molded quickly into expressions of terror and awe. Some of the soldiers who turned the corner into the central area of the garage dropped their guns. One soldier fainted and fell to the ground. They must be looking at the Byasein, as Gyutono's carrier truck was beginning to turn the corner too. Then, he too was forced to behold what his soldiers were staring at. Then came the other trucks, the rest of the minifig personnel, the mobile armored mortar, and Kopaka and his men. Everyone was now looking at the same thing. The garage they had now entered was almost totally empty, a large and blank landscape with those large light bulbs high up on the ceiling, dropping light onto their surreal world. Indeed, the garage needed to be wide open and empty, if it was to house the monster that was currently nesting within. The only thing that truly occupied this vast open space was the horror that had plagued the Bionicles and minifigs ever since they entered the New Land. The heads of all the members of the army did not look outward. No, their heads were turned upward, gazing high into the air above them. From the ground of the garage and high up almost halfway to the garage's ceiling sat a virtual mountain of Bionicle and minifig parts, crudely piled one upon the other into an unnaturally large and hulking single mound of Bionicle body parts, minifig corpses, and minifig architecture and technology. The mound of parts possessed a base that extended throughout the entire garage, and the parts slowly coned upward until they reached the very top. The gargantuan blob of parts was so large it made the mobile armored mortar look like a pea. All space within this vast chamber, this vast garage, was nearly taken up by this one giant entity. This alone cannot describe what the army was seeing. Long streams of parts, both minifig and Bionicle, extended out from the bottom of this mountain of parts into various areas of the garage. Their paths were so intricate that no one could tell where they led to. Not all of these tentacles were lying on the ground, though. Around the area at the top of the mountain of parts were dozens more tentacles that extended off of the top of the mountain of parts and into the areas of the garage's ceiling. As everyone observed and studied these tentacles, they remembered Gyutono's analogy of an octopus that dug its tentacles into the soil and earth of this very world. These tentacles went on for unfathomably long distances, and extended beyond the garage into all areas of this mysterious house. They were so long that they even managed to reach the backyard of this house, the place that Bionicles and minifigs refer to as the New Land. Wherever these tentacles did end, disgusting monsters so terribly similar to those encountered outside were probably slowly forming, and once completed, would be sent out to destroy and butcher the settlers of the New Land. Most unnerving of all, the mountain of parts was very slowly moving, pulsating around as if every single part of the giant mountain was physically connected to one another, all part of a single being, as the book Observations of a Strange World had described. The tinking noise Gyutono had identified was indeed coming from this being. It was the sound of millions of little chunks of minifig and Bionicle parts clinking against each other as this mountain of parts pulsated and moved slowly in its stationary place. The members of the army could not speak. They were petrified with the sight before them. One of Kopaka's men gasped, and pointed a trembling finger to a certain region of the mountain of parts. Sticking out halfway from the side of the mountain of parts was the head of one of the gangsters killed out in the New Land. The minifigs were experiencing terrible sensations. The bodies of family members and friends killed by the monsters were probably buried somewhere deep inside this disgusting mound of parts. The material used to build the beautiful colonies the New Land minifig empire built across their territory was nothing more than stuff to help this mountain maintain its titanic height. The army continued to gaze up, not a single member without unflinching awe. In a perverse and sinister way, this otherworldly horror was itself a part of them. It was a mockery of them and all they had accomplished. It had taken what they built and used it itself. This grotesque super-being was a mockery to everyone in the army. It fermented in everyone below a most genuine sense of undeniable inferiority. This was the Byasein, the source of all suffering in the New Land. Seeing this monstrosity answered nothing the minifigs and bionicles had wanted to discover, except what the Byasein looked like. The perpetually dwarfing mountain of parts remained placid, hardly reacting in any way to the presence of the army below. Army. The term was almost an overstatement of the force the bionicles and minifigs had brought to face the Byasein. Compared to this titan, their army was like a little pack of flies, not a threat, simply an annoyance. Members of the army looked to the ground. They saw the dead minifig corpse used by the Byasein to lure them here, lying on the ground, with a tentacle extending from its back deep into the Byasein's main body. While the members of the army continued with great futility to understand what the Byasein was and to process everything they were seeing in their heads, Gavla was having a great rush of thoughts. The knowledge the Byasein gave her was so immense, she wasn't even sure she understood it. No one here knew what the Byasein was, but she did. She knew she did. It was part of the knowledge the emissary transferred to her. The minifig corpse lying on the ground, the one used to lure the army into this lair, was not the minifig scholar who wrote Observations of a Strange World. She knew, though, who did write it, and she wasn't sure how it was possible. The minifig scholar, the real one, was the Byasein. In her mind, she went through the information she had obtained. The minifig scholar was once a minifig. Somehow, he had become this, an alien being of unparalleled size and power. How was it possible? What had happened to him? More information flooded into Gavla's mind. It was almost overwhelming. But with time, the facts began making sense. The minifig scholar had been in the New Land long before the other bionicles or minifigs. In fact, so long before they had arrived in the New Land that it may have been before Gavla was even born. During this time, he wrote the book, Observations of a Strange World, describing a being so immense that it was almost a god. But he was not talking about himself. He was talking about something else. After he wrote the book, he left it behind, and at some point he became this, the Byasein. It made no sense to Gavla right away, but a revelation came. This minifig scholar, long before the settlers of the New Land arrived, was somehow given great powers of his own, and slowly became the Byasein, much like how Gavla was given powers by the emissary. Something had chosen the minifig scholar to become the Byasein, and the Byasein chose Gavla for... she wasn't sure what. And then it hit her. Her mind fully comprehended this ultimate scenario. There were Byaseins before this one. She shuddered to think what they looked like. But at one point, one Byasein selected the minifig scholar to be the next Byasein, and it gave him powers so great that he would eventually become the abomination that sat before them. And now the minifig scholar, now a Byasein, had chosen Gavla to be something. She was not sure what. But more things had become clear to Gavla. Throughout the army's journey, There was discussion about the entire place being a house. It was. And she knew for a fact that they were toys of some kind, simple children's toys. But the question was, where were the owners? Gavla knew that as well, at least vaguely. Something had happened to the owners of this house, something beyond the knowledge she was given. Something happened to the former owners of this house, and they would not be returning, nor would they ever be seen again. The knowledge she possessed told her the Byasein, the one before it, these Byaseins had some connection to this all. The substance known as arthene, Gavla also had information on. It was the byproduct of something, and this she did not know what, but it was essential to the existence of the Byasein. It had something to do with the Byasein's disgusting powers. Gavla believed what the emissary injected her with was something related to arthene, but she did not know what. Still, Gavla knew that she was lacking in many answers to what the Byaseins were. Where they came from, how they obtained their powers, what arthene was, and how they could take on these menacing forms. All things Gavla was denied answers to, but she knew enough. The Byasein was all-powerful. The Byasein had linked itself with this very world, and it could manipulate it, like how it switched on the lights at will, and it could manipulate virtually anything else as well. It had done so to everything the Bionicles and minifigs had brought into the new land, and it had trusted Gavla with its legacy, giving her these powers, with the promise that she would use them to destroy the minifig race. But Gavla laughed in her mind. The Byasein was so mighty, so infinitely powerful, and yet she began to realize something else the Byasein was. The Byasein was naive, very naive. It trusted she would use the most supreme power of their world to destroy the minifigs. Oh, she would. If she would ever become as mighty as this Byasein, she would destroy the minifigs. At first she was repelled by the idea that she might become something similar to this Byasein, but she quickly overcame that. If it meant power, intelligence, and supremacy beyond any form of life in the world, she'd gladly accept the mutation. But she was not going to destroy the minifig race for the Byasein. No, she was going to do it for herself. She was not going to be naive. Coursing through her veins were the powers of the gods, and with time she could access them at will. But only she. I will be beyond everything, Gavla thought with a foul and joyous excitement. I will move my way through this unsuspecting world, and will rise above everything and everyone. And when the time comes for me to become like the Byasein, my powers will soar so high that I will become invincible. This world will be mine. But, she remembered, the Byasein was still alive in this garage. The army still had to kill it.